Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift beside a river in the hour after sunset, when the last warmth has left the stones and the surface begins to hold the color of the sky. The current moves without hurry, slipping past reeds and fields, carrying snowmelt from mountains far away. To the river, these places are not separate, only bends in the same descent toward the sea. Long before there were countries, passports, or border posts, fresh water decided where people could remain. A spring made one patch of ground dependable. A floodplain renewed tired soil. A river offered drinking water, food, transport, and a path through forests and deserts. Settlements gathered beside these moving ribbons, first as clusters of homes, then as towns, and eventually as cities with canals, markets, and laws. The earliest civilizations did not merely stand near rivers, they were organized around them. Along the Nile, the annual flood laid dark silt across the fields of Egypt. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, communities dug channels to guide uncertain water across dry land. In the Indus Valley, cities were built with wells and drains. Farther east, the Yellow River nourished farms while reminding generations that water could sustain life and overwhelm it. Fresh water was never only something to drink. It determined how much grain could be grown, how large a city could become, and how long a kingdom might endure through drought. To manage water was to manage planting, harvest, storage, flood, and famine. Those who maintained canals and reservoirs gained authority, because the work required cooperation, labor, records, and rules. Yet a river is difficult to govern. It begins where rain falls or snow gathers, often far from those who depend on it most. It crosses landscapes without asking permission, receiving tributaries, losing water to heat, and sinking quietly into the ground. Much later, human beings drew borders across these waters. A river might begin in one country, form the edge of a second, and irrigate the farms of a third. The line on the map could be sharp, but the current remained fluid. An upstream nation could store water behind a dam, turn it through turbines, or divert it into canals. Downstream, another nation might watch the level fall and wonder whether a distant decision had altered its future. This is where the quiet wars for water begin, not always with soldiers, but with measurements, treaties, reservoirs, maps, and anxious seasons without rain. They begin with a truth every civilization learns. Water is essential, but control over it is never evenly shared. And so, tonight, we will follow rivers that nations cannot fully own, through valleys where cooperation and rivalry have flowed side by side. For now, the current moves through the darkness, carrying no flag, recognizing no border, belonging for a little while to everyone it passes. The river carries us backward now, beyond the maps of modern nations and into the first long experiments in settlement, when people began to trust that a place might feed them season after season. In the valleys of great rivers, permanence was not a simple gift. Water arrived with moods of its own, sometimes generous, sometimes absent, and sometimes so abundant that walls, fields, and homes disappeared beneath it. Along the Nile, the year was once measured by the rise and fall of the flood. Water spread across the valley, slowed, and withdrew, leaving behind fine, dark soil carried from distant highlands. Farmers learned to read the river's height, to prepare fields at the right moment, and to store grain against leaner years. The flood did not merely support agriculture. It shaped calendars, taxes, religious festivals, and the authority of those who claimed to understand its pattern. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates behaved less predictably. Their floods could arrive with destructive force, and their channels wandered across the plain. Communities cut canals through dry ground, raised embankments, and organized labor to clear silt from waterways. A canal left untended could choke. A bank left weak could fail. Water management, therefore, became a shared obligation, and shared obligations slowly became institutions. Farther east, the cities of the Indus Valley were built with wells, drains, bathing spaces, and carefully planned streets. The remains of these cities suggest societies that treated water not as an afterthought, but as part of urban design. In northern China, communities along the Yellow River faced a different challenge. The river carried enormous quantities of silt, raising its bed and making floods both fertile and dangerous. To live beside it required constant attention. Across these regions, a quiet pattern appeared. Water encouraged cooperation, but it also created hierarchy. Someone had to decide when gates were opened, which fields received water first, and who would repair a broken channel. Those decisions could determine harvests, debts, and survival. Control of water became one of the earliest forms of political power. Yet this power was never complete. Kings could order canals dug, officials could measure fields, and laborers could raise walls of earth, but no ruler could command the rain. Drought still arrived. Floods still exceeded expectation. Rivers shifted course without consulting palaces. Civilization grew from this uneasy bargain. Human beings learned to shape water, while water continued to shape them. Every canal promised order, and every flood reminded the builders that order was temporary. As the night deepens, we follow that lesson forward, toward the age when rivers would be measured more precisely, stored behind walls, and turned into instruments of national ambition. For thousands of years, people guided water with ditches, terraces, wells, and reservoirs, but the desire to control it never stopped growing. Each new settlement required a dependable supply. Each expanding city demanded cleaner water, stronger banks, and greater storage. A channel beside a field gradually became an architecture of civilization. Aqueducts carried water across valleys and into cities. Cisterns held rainfall beneath courtyards. Stepwells descended into the earth, following the water table through dry seasons. In mountain regions, terraces slowed runoff and allowed crops to grow on steep slopes. Across the world, different societies reached the same conclusion. Water could not always be brought to people by waiting. It had to be captured, lifted, redirected, and preserved. These systems required more than engineering. They required rules. A farmer opening a gate too early might deprive another field downstream. A neglected channel could damage an entire district. Communities developed schedules, duties, fines, and customs around the distribution of water. Some survived for centuries because they were understood as social agreements, not merely technical systems. The state also grew more present. Officials surveyed canals, recorded land, collected taxes, and organized repairs. Waterworks could display the reach of a ruler, linking distant provinces to a central authority. A reservoir might protect a city from drought, but it might also remind the people who had ordered it built. Water gave governments a reason to count, plan, and command. Still, the river resisted simplicity. Its flow changed with seasons. Snow accumulated in one region while crops depended on it far away. Heavy rain in the mountains could produce disaster days later on a plain whose sky remained clear. The people downstream experienced causes they could not see. This hidden connection is one of water's most important qualities. A river joins distant landscapes into a single system. Forests in the upper basin influence floods below. Wetlands slow water and trap sediment. Glaciers release meltwater during warm months. Groundwater may feed a river quietly even when rain has not fallen for weeks. What appears to be a local stream is often the result of events spread across an entire continent. For most of history, these connections were understood through experience. People watched marks on stone, remembered the timing of floods, and passed warnings from one generation to the next. In time, instruments became more precise. River levels were recorded, rainfall was measured, engineers calculated storage and flow. With measurement came confidence, and with confidence came larger ambitions. If a canal could guide a stream, perhaps a dam could govern a river. If water could be stored for one village, perhaps it could be stored for a nation. The idea was powerful, and it would transform both landscapes and politics. A dam appears simple from a distance, a wall across a valley, water gathered behind it, and a river continuing below. Yet within that quiet shape lies an extraordinary rearrangement of time. A river that once rose and fell with the seasons can be held back, released gradually, or directed elsewhere. Flood water can become stored water. A restless current can become a reservoir. For the nation that builds it, a dam may promise many things at once. Water stored during wet months can irrigate crops through dry ones. Turbines can turn fallen water into electricity. Cities can gain a more reliable supply. Floods can be reduced, roads and industry supported, and remote regions drawn into the economy. It is easy to understand why dams became symbols of progress. But a dam does not create water. It changes when and where the water moves. Upstream, valleys may disappear beneath reservoirs, covering villages, farms, roads, and ancient sites. Sediment that once traveled downstream settles behind the wall. Fish migrations can be interrupted. The water may become warmer or colder, clearer or more stagnant, depending on how the reservoir is operated. Downstream, the changes can be harder to see at first. A floodplain that once received fresh silt may slowly lose fertility. Wetlands may shrink. Fisheries may decline. Farmers who relied on seasonal floods may find the river arriving at unfamiliar times. During drought, the release schedule of an upstream dam can become a matter of national concern. This is why large dams are never only engineering projects when rivers cross borders. They are also statements of power. The country controlling the reservoir may decide how quickly it fills, how much water is released, and when electricity generation takes priority over downstream needs. Even where no water is permanently consumed, timing alone can matter greatly. The upstream nation may see development long denied to it. It may ask why others should claim historic rights to water that falls as rain on its own mountains. The downstream nation may answer that millions of people, generations of farms, and entire cities have already been built around the existing flow. Both arguments can contain truth, and this is what makes river disputes so difficult. A dam, therefore, becomes more than concrete and steel. It becomes a negotiation made visible. Every gate, turbine, and reservoir level can carry political meaning. Technical questions, how quickly to fill, how much to release in a dry year, how to share data, become questions of trust. And so, the quiet wars for water are often conducted not on battlefields, but in control rooms and conference halls. Engineers present models. Diplomats compare treaties. Farmers watch the riverbank. Satellite images reveal the changing shape of a reservoir. Far away, behind a wall in the mountains, water waits, and entire nations wonder when it will move again. To divide a river fairly, one must first answer a question that sounds simple. How much water is there? The answer changes from year to year, from season to season, and sometimes from 1 hour to the next. A river is not a fixed quantity. It is weather moving through a landscape. Rainfall varies. Snowpack melts early or late. Heat increases evaporation from soil, canals, and reservoirs. Forests are cleared or restored. Cities expand. Farmers plant crops that need more water than those grown before. Wells draw from aquifers that may also feed the river. By the time the current reaches the sea, countless choices have altered it. Treaties have tried to create certainty within this uncertainty. Some assign fixed volumes to each country. Others divide the river by percentage. Some protect older uses. Others emphasize equal rights across the basin. Agreements may require countries to avoid significant harm, exchange data, consult before major projects, or cooperate during drought. Each method has weaknesses. A fixed allocation can become unrealistic. When the river shrinks, a percentage may feel fair in theory, but unstable in practice. Historic use favors those who developed first, often leaving less for nations once too poor or constrained to build. Equal shares may ignore population, geography, or the fact that one country depends on the river for nearly everything while another has several alternatives. Even the word use can be difficult. Water released through a hydropower turbine usually continues downstream, but its timing has changed. Irrigation removes more water through evaporation and plant growth. A reservoir may lose large amounts to heat. A city may return treated water to the river, though not always in the same condition or place. Measurements can also become political. Countries may disagree over where flows are recorded, which years are normal, and how climate is included. A hydrological model may appear neutral, yet the assumptions inside it can favor one side. Numbers do not end a dispute when the parties do not trust the hands collecting them. Still, measurement is also the beginning of cooperation. Shared gauges, rainfall records, satellites, and warnings can reduce suspicion. When countries see the same data, they can argue over a common river rather than over separate versions of it. This is the quiet work behind every successful water agreement. Not one grand solution, but repeated observation, negotiation, and adjustment. The river must be measured again each morning. The reservoir must be reviewed before each season. Drought plans must exist before the drought arrives. Soon, our journey will turn toward the Nile, where nearly every question of geography, history, and dependence gathers into one long river. But first, the current teaches us something essential. Water can be divided on paper, yet it remains alive in motion, changing as the world around it changes. The Nile comes into view slowly, not as a single river at first, but as a gathering of waters spread across half a continent. Far to the south, rain falls among the lakes and wetlands of equatorial Africa. Farther east, seasonal storms descend upon the Ethiopian highlands. Streams become tributaries. Tributaries become rivers, and eventually their waters meet, turning north toward a country where almost no rain falls. This direction has always given the Nile its strange character. It carries water from wetter lands into one of the driest regions on earth. Across Sudan and Egypt, the river narrows the distance between fertile life and open desert. Green fields follow its banks in a long, delicate corridor, while beyond them the land becomes pale, dry, and immense. The river most people call the Nile is formed through several major branches. The White Nile rises from the equatorial lake region and travels through vast wetlands where its flow is slowed and softened. The Blue Nile begins in the Ethiopian highlands, leaving Lake Tana and descending through deep valleys. During the rainy season, the Blue Nile brings much of the water and sediment that once produced Egypt's great annual flood. The Atbara, also descending from Ethiopia, adds another seasonal pulse. For centuries, people downstream experienced the river without seeing the places where its water began. A clear sky over Egypt could accompany a rising flood created by rains thousands of kilometers away. It was familiar and mysterious, measured carefully at home, but governed by distant weather. Along its banks, agriculture became a rhythm of waiting. Farmers watched the rise, prepared the basins, and planted after the water withdrew. Villages settled on higher ground. Officials recorded levels using marked wells and stone stairways, sometimes called nilometers. The height of the water could suggest abundance, shortage, or danger. And from that knowledge came decisions about grain and taxation. But dependence grew deeper as populations expanded and modern agriculture demanded water throughout the year. Canals widened. Pumps lifted water farther from the channel. Cities drew steadily from the river. Egypt, in particular, came to rely on the Nile for nearly all of its renewable fresh water, while Sudan also built much of its farming and settlement along the same system. Upstream, however, the river passed through countries with their own needs, histories, and hopes for development. The rainfall might begin there, but much of the water had long been used farther north. This difference between origin and dependence would become the heart of the Nile dispute. In the darkness, the river still appears whole. It moves through papyrus, farmland, villages, and cities without revealing which portion belongs to whom. Yet human agreements would soon attempt to divide its future, assigning numbers to a current older than every state along its banks. As empires expanded across Africa, the Nile became part of a political map drawn largely by powers from beyond the basin. Colonial governments viewed the river as both a source of life and an asset to be measured, protected, and directed toward favored territories. British influence was especially strong in Egypt and Sudan, where cotton, irrigation, and control of the river became closely linked. Colonial agreements sought to preserve downstream supplies and limit projects that might reduce the flow reaching Egypt. One agreement in 1929 recognized a large share for Egypt and gave it a strong voice over upstream works and territories then under British administration. The arrangement reflected the politics of its time. Many upstream societies were not independent states at the negotiating table. Their future needs were barely represented, while downstream irrigation was treated as an established fact. The river was divided according to power as much as geography. 3 decades later, Egypt and Sudan signed another agreement in 1959. It allocated nearly all of the measured average flow between those two countries and supported major storage works, notably Egypt's High Aswan Dam. It brought predictability to both states, but other basin countries were not parties to it. For Egypt, these agreements became part of a long argument about historic use and national survival. Its towns, farms, and population had grown along a river that crossed hundreds of kilometers of desert before reaching them. Any major reduction in flow could therefore feel less like an inconvenience and more like an existential threat. For upstream countries, the same history looked different. They asked why arrangements made under colonial rule should permanently restrict their ability to produce electricity, irrigate land, and supply growing cities. Ethiopia, which contributes much of the Nile's seasonal flow through the Blue Nile and other tributaries, had received no fixed allocation under the 1959 agreement. These competing memories matter because water disputes are never only about volume, they are also about legitimacy. One side may point to long use, settled communities, and treaties. Another may point to sovereignty, unequal history, and the principle that all basin states should benefit from a shared river. In later years, Countries of the Nile Basin created institutions for dialogue and technical cooperation. They shared studies, discussed development, and tried to imagine a more inclusive framework. Yet the central question remained unresolved. Could a river governed by old agreements be rearranged for a new political age without making those downstream feel less secure? The river offered no answer. It continued north, indifferent to the papers signed beside it. But beneath the sound of its current, two ideas had begun to meet: the right to continue living as before, and the right to build a different future. To understand Ethiopia's position, we rise with the river into the highlands, where the air is cooler and the land folds into steep ridges and deep valleys. Here, summer rains gather over broad plateaus, feeding streams that rush toward the Blue Nile. Water is abundant in season, yet reliable electricity and irrigation have not always been. For much of the 20th century, Ethiopia remained one of the world's least electrified countries. Many homes and businesses lacked dependable power, while limited infrastructure constrained development. To Ethiopian planners, the water descending from the highlands represented a vast source of energy, passing largely unused beyond the country's borders. Hydropower offered a particular promise. Unlike an irrigation diversion, a hydroelectric dam does not necessarily consume most of the water passing through it. The river enters a reservoir, falls through turbines, produces electricity, and continues downstream. From this perspective, storing the Blue Nile to generate power could support development, while allowing the water itself to keep moving north. Yet, timing matters. A large reservoir must first be filled, and during that period, some water is held back. Later, the dam's operation determines how much is released during wet and dry seasons. Downstream nations therefore focus not only on total annual flow, but on the pace of filling, the management of prolonged drought, and the coordination of reservoirs along the river. Ethiopia also viewed control of the project as a matter of dignity and independence. The Great Dam would be built largely through domestic financing, including bonds purchased by citizens and contributions from workers. It became more than an energy project, becoming a national symbol representing the belief that the country should be able to use the river rising within its territory. Egypt saw the same project through the lens of dependence. Its farms, cities, and water system had been organized around an established flow. Even temporary reductions could create anxiety, especially during dry years. Sudan, positioned between Ethiopia and Egypt, faced a more complicated balance. It could benefit from regulated flows, reduced flooding, cheaper electricity, and less sediment, while also carrying risks if dam operations were poorly coordinated. Thus, the Blue Nile came to hold three different visions at once. For Ethiopia, it was an engine of development. For Sudan, it could be both opportunity and hazard. For Egypt, it was the principal source of a river on which so much depended. No single vision was imaginary. Each emerged from geography and real need. This is why the dispute resisted simple judgment. The question was not whether water should support civilization. It already did. The question was whose development should come first, and how one nation's long-awaited progress could be arranged without becoming another nation's fear. In 2011, Ethiopia announced that it had begun building a vast hydroelectric project near its border with Sudan. It would come to be known as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GEARD, a name that captured both its physical scale and the hope invested in it. The site lay on the Blue Nile, where the river leaves the Ethiopian highlands and approaches the plains of Sudan. The dam was designed as one of Africa's largest hydropower facilities, with a reservoir holding many billions of cubic meters. Its turbines promised electricity for Ethiopia and potentially for neighboring countries through power trade. Construction changed the balance of the Nile negotiations. For decades, discussion had centered on legal rights and future plans. Now concrete was being poured, tunnels excavated, and a reservoir prepared. The question was no longer whether Ethiopia might build a major dam, but how it would be filled and operated. Egypt worried that rapid filling could reduce the water reaching Lake Nasser, particularly if several dry years occurred together. It sought a binding agreement with clear rules for drought, dispute resolution, data exchange, and releases. Ethiopia emphasized its sovereign right to develop the river and resisted arrangements it believed might preserve older inequalities or restrict future operation. Sudan stood between them geographically and diplomatically. The project could regulate floods, reduce sediment entering Sudanese reservoirs, and provide electricity. Yet a dam of such size also required confidence in design, safety, and daily coordination. Sudden or poorly communicated releases could affect communities and infrastructure downstream. Technical committees met. Heads of government exchanged statements. International mediators became involved at different moments. Negotiation moved between engineering and law, reservoir levels, drought thresholds, annual releases, data sharing schedules, and whether agreed guidelines should be legally binding. In 2015, the three countries signed a Declaration of Principles. It acknowledged cooperation, equitable use, avoiding significant harm, and exchanging information. It created a shared foundation, but it did not settle the operating rules that would matter most during dry years. As construction advanced, Ethiopia began filling the reservoir in stages during rainy seasons. Each rise became visible from space and closely watched downstream. Ethiopia celebrated progress toward electricity generation. Egypt renewed calls for a comprehensive agreement. Sudan's position shifted as its governments weighed benefits, risks, and regional politics. The river, meanwhile, continued through the turbines and onward. The dam did not end the Nile, nor erase downstream dependence. It placed a new center of control upon the current, transforming an ancient river into a modern test of whether trust could be engineered as carefully as concrete. The hardest negotiations begin not in abundance, but in the imagined years when rain fails. In a wet season, A reservoir can fill while enough water continues downstream. During a long drought, however, every stored meter becomes more valuable, and every release becomes more difficult. This is the central challenge of the Blue Nile. Ethiopia wants to protect the dam's ability to generate electricity and recover after dry periods. Egypt wants assurance that the reservoir will not hold back too much water when its own supply is already strained. Sudan wants predictable coordination to gain the benefits of regulated flow and protect people below the dam. These concerns lead to technical questions carrying enormous political weight. At what level should more water be released? How should countries define a prolonged drought? Must Ethiopia compensate for low rainfall by releasing water already stored from previous years? Who verifies the measurements if the parties disagree? Climate makes the answers harder. The Nile has always varied, but warming temperatures increase evaporation and place more pressure on farms and cities. Population growth raises demand throughout the basin. New irrigation, industry, and cities mean the river must serve more people even when its flow remains uncertain. A durable agreement would therefore need flexibility. It would recognize that no formula can predict every sequence of wet and dry years. It would need shared data, regular consultation, advanced notice of major operational changes, and procedures for revising the rules as conditions evolve. Trust may be the most difficult requirement of all. A downstream state can see only the water that arrives. An upstream state may fear that every concession will become a permanent restriction. When trust is weak, ordinary reservoir operations can look like deliberate pressure. Yet the dam also creates reasons to cooperate. Coordinated operation between Ethiopia's reservoir and downstream dams could reduce waste, improve electricity generation, smooth seasonal flows, and manage drought across the basin. Power trade could give neighboring states an economic interest in the project's success. Shared monitoring could replace suspicion with common evidence. This is the quieter possibility within the idea of a water war. The same geography that creates leverage also creates interdependence. Ethiopia cannot move the river away from Sudan and Egypt. Egypt cannot relocate the rainfall of the Ethiopian highlands. Sudan cannot escape its place between them. Each country is bound to the others by the direction of the current. As we leave the Blue Nile for a while, the reservoir rests beneath the night sky. Dark water held among the hills. Far downstream, pumps continue to turn and fields continue to drink. Between them lies no simple victory, only the patient task of building rules strong enough to survive the next dry season. Beyond the Nile, the night carries us eastward, across desert and mountain, toward two rivers whose names are almost inseparable from the beginning of cities. The Tigris and Euphrates descend from the uplands of modern Turkey, then travel through Syria and Iraq, gathering tributaries before approaching one another on the low plain. Together, they gave the ancient region of Mesopotamia its familiar meaning, the land between the rivers. Here, rainfall was often too uncertain for large harvests, yet the soil of the plain could be rich when water reached it. Early communities dug canals from the rivers, guiding the current toward barley fields, orchards, and grazing land. They raised levees, cleared silt, and divided water according to season. The work demanded memory and coordination because a neglected channel upstream could leave farms dry far below. From this careful management grew settlements such as Uruk, Ur, Babylon, and many others whose walls once rose above a network of watercourses. Boats carried grain, timber, stone, and people. Clay tablets recorded deliveries, land, labor, and disputes. The rivers were roads, reservoirs, boundaries, and sources of food, but they were never entirely obedient. The Tigris moved quickly and could flood with sudden force. The Euphrates followed a broader, slower path, shifting across the plain over centuries. A canal that served one city might silt up or be redirected toward another. Kingdoms competed for land and for the channels that made land productive. Yet conflict was only one part of the story. Most days were devoted to maintenance, lifting gates, repairing banks, measuring fields, and letting water pass from one neighbor to the next. In later centuries, the rivers supported great Islamic cities, among them Baghdad, where gardens, markets, workshops, and libraries flourished beside the Tigris. Irrigation systems expanded and declined as governments changed, wars damaged infrastructure, and sediment slowly altered the landscape. The rivers endured every dynasty, though the societies beside them repeatedly had to rebuild their relationship with water. Modern borders eventually divided the basin into upstream and downstream states. Turkey held the high ground where much of the flow begins. Syria lay below along the Euphrates. Iraq, whose identity and agriculture were deeply entwined with both rivers, occupied the broad lower plain. Once again, old dependence met new sovereignty. The waters that had joined Mesopotamia into one living system now crossed checkpoints and national frontiers. Their ancient channels remained, but the decisions shaping them would increasingly be made behind modern dams, far from the marshes and fields waiting far below them. During the 20th century, governments along the Tigris and Euphrates saw unfinished national projects in the rivers. Water still escaped during floods. Dry summers still limited farming. Rivers descending from high plateaus carried energy that could be turned into electricity. Large dams seemed to offer a more orderly future. Turkey began developing an extensive program of reservoirs, power stations, and irrigation works across its southeast. The project promised electricity, new farmland, employment, and closer economic ties between a poorer region and the rest of the country. The Ataturk Dam on the Euphrates became its most visible symbol, holding a vast lake behind a wall of earth and rock. From upstream, this appeared to be the use of a national resource for development. Downstream, the same structures looked like gates placed across a shared inheritance. Syria and Iraq feared that greater storage and irrigation in Turkey could reduce the quantity of water reaching them during drought. Irrigation mattered differently from hydropower. Water passing through turbines could continue downstream, while irrigation water was partly absorbed by crops or lost to evaporation. Syria also built dams and expanded irrigation along the Euphrates, adding another layer between Turkey and Iraq. By the time the river reached the Iraqi border, it had already passed through reservoirs, canals, cities, and farms in 2 countries. Iraq remained the final major user, carrying the combined effects of every decision made above. The 3 governments negotiated at different moments and reached partial arrangements, including commitments concerning cross-border flow. Yet they did not create a single, comprehensive agreement allocating both rivers across the entire basin. They also described the system differently. Turkey often spoke of transboundary rivers to be used equitably. Syria and Iraq emphasized the idea of international rivers whose established downstream uses deserved protection. Beyond diplomacy, the basin became burdened by war, damaged infrastructure, pollution, inefficient irrigation, population growth, and increasing heat. A low river could no longer be blamed upon one cause alone. It might reflect weak rainfall, reservoir operations, leaking canals, increased withdrawals, or several of these at once. In southern Iraq, where the rivers approach the great marshes, the consequences gather quietly. Less water means greater salinity, smaller harvests, stressed wetlands, and greater difficulty pushing seawater away from the lower channels. No army needs to cross a border for upstream control to be felt. A reservoir level, a release schedule, or a newly irrigated plain can alter life hundreds of kilometers away. And so the power of the upper basin remains both ordinary and immense. The ability to decide not whether the river will flow forever, but how much of it will arrive and when. From Mesopotamia, we drift east toward the mountains of South Asia, where snow and ice feed another great river system. The Indus rises on the high Tibetan plateau, bends through the Himalaya and Karakoram, and enters the plains that now lie mostly within Pakistan. Along the way it gathers the waters of the Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Beas, and Sutlej, rivers whose names have shaped the landscape of Punjab, the land of 5 waters. Communities built wells and canals across these plains, and under British rule, the irrigation network expanded into one of the largest on Earth. Barrages and headworks raised river levels and directed water into long canals. Dry land was settled and cultivated. Villages and markets grew around flows managed through gates rather than rainfall alone. Then, in 1947, British India was divided into India and Pakistan. The new border crossed not only towns and fields, but the plumbing of the plain. Some canal headworks remained in India, while the channels they supplied continued into Pakistan. Rivers rose in one state and nourished farms across a border that had not existed before. Partition brought immense human suffering, migration, and violence. Within that wider upheaval, water became an urgent practical question. Pakistan depended heavily upon an irrigation system whose upper controls were now across the frontier. India, also facing poverty, displacement, and the need for development, rejected the idea that every existing use must remain unchanged forever. Temporary arrangements prevented breakdown, but did not resolve the deeper issue. Could an inherited network be managed jointly by two new states whose political relationship had already become hostile? Should old canal use determine future rights? Or should the rivers be divided so each country could operate more independently? Negotiations began with engineers examining maps, flows, canals, and possible replacement works. The World Bank became involved, first encouraging joint development and later helping shape a practical division. The discussions lasted for years because water could not simply be moved by words. If Pakistan lost dependable access to eastern channels, new canals and reservoirs would be needed to carry water from rivers assigned to it. The Indus dispute, therefore, became a question of both law and construction. A settlement required an immense rearrangement of infrastructure. Rivers would be linked, storage would be built. Farming districts would gradually receive water from different sources. At night, the canals appear peaceful, reflecting small lights from distant homes. Yet beneath their steady surfaces lies the memory of a border drawn through a hydraulic system. The lesson was simple. Land could be partitioned in a season, but water networks, built over generations, could not be separated without patience, money, and a remarkable degree of agreement. In 1960, after years of negotiation, India and Pakistan signed the Indus Waters Treaty, with the World Bank participating in specified roles. The arrangement did not require the two countries to manage every river together. Instead, it divided the system in a way that allowed each side greater control over different waters. The three eastern rivers, the Ravi, Beas, and Sutlej, were allocated for India's unrestricted use after a transition period. The three western rivers, the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, were reserved largely for Pakistan, while India retained defined rights for domestic use, limited irrigation, navigation, and certain hydropower projects. To make the division workable, Pakistan required replacement infrastructure. Reservoirs, barrages, and link canals carried western river water to areas that had relied on the eastern ones. The treaty was not only a document, it became a physical redesign of the basin, financed with international support and carried out across years of excavation and construction. A permanent Indus Commission, with one commissioner from each country, was created to exchange information, inspect works, and address questions. It also created stages for disagreements, beginning with the commission and, depending on the issue, moving to a neutral expert or arbitration. For decades, this framework endured through wars, border crises, and long periods of political hostility. Disputes arose over the design of Indian hydropower projects on the western rivers, yet both countries continued to argue largely through the procedures of the treaty. Its survival became a widely cited example of water cooperation between rivals. But endurance does not mean permanence. In April 2025, after a deadly attack in Kashmir, India announced that it was placing the treaty in abeyance, linking restoration to its demands concerning cross-border terrorism. Pakistan rejected the move, and India continued to state in 2026 that the decision remained in force. A framework once praised for standing apart from wider conflict had itself become entangled in that conflict. The rivers did not stop. Snow still melted, canals still carried water, and farmers still prepared their fields. Yet the institutional habits surrounding the current, meetings, data, notices, inspections, and agreed methods of dispute became less certain. The Indus story therefore offers no simple ending. It shows that a treaty can protect cooperation for generations, even between states that distrust one another deeply. It also shows that agreements must be renewed in practice, not merely preserved on paper. Water may encourage restraint because both sides depend upon continuity. But when political trust becomes thin enough, even an enduring river treaty can begin to feel fragile, like a canal bank awaiting the next season's flood. Our journey turns west toward a river far smaller than the Nile, Indus, Tigris, or Euphrates, yet carrying an exceptional weight of history. The Jordan flows through a narrow basin where rain is limited and many communities depend on the same modest sources. Its upper waters gathered near Mount Hermon from streams rising in Lebanon, Syria, and areas controlled by Israel. They enter the Sea of Galilee, then continue south through the Jordan Valley. The Yarmouk joins from the east before the lower river moves toward the Dead Sea at the lowest exposed land on earth. In ancient memory, the Jordan was a boundary, a crossing place, and a sacred river. In modern times, it became part of a contested geography involving Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestinians. Here, water and territory were difficult to separate. Control of a spring, lakeshore, or pumping station could affect supply elsewhere. During the 20th century, plans proposed dividing the basin's water among neighboring states. Technical understandings emerged even where political agreement did not. But competing national projects diverted water away from the river. Israel carried water from the Sea of Galilee to cities and farms. Jordan developed the Yarmouk and the East Gore Canal, later called the King Abdullah Canal. Syria built reservoirs across the Yarmouk's tributaries. As withdrawals increased, the lower Jordan diminished. A river once fed by strong freshwater flows became, in many stretches, a much smaller current shaped by return flows, saline springs, and treated wastewater. The shrinking river contributed to the decline of the Dead Sea alongside mineral extraction and other diversions. Water entered formal diplomacy in 1994, when Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty containing detailed provisions on allocations, storage, cooperation, and seasonal exchanges. The arrangements did not remove scarcity, but recognized that neither country could manage the system alone. Palestinian water questions remained more unsettled. The Oslo agreements created interim arrangements and a joint committee for parts of the West Bank, while leaving permanent rights for later negotiation. Population growth, unequal access, damaged infrastructure, and conflict have kept water tied to the wider dispute. The Jordan Basin reveals how scarcity magnifies every decision. On a great river, one diversion may be absorbed by an enormous flow, Here, each spring and well can matter, yet practical cooperation has persisted. Water delivered across borders, technicians exchanging information, and reservoirs operated with neighboring needs in mind. The river is small enough to cross in places, but no single shore can command its whole journey. Under the moon, it moves quietly toward the Dead Sea, carrying the ancient lesson that limited water must be shared even when nearly everything around it remains unresolved. From Jordan, the current carries us east again, across deserts, mountains, and monsoon forests, until it joins one of Asia's great wandering rivers. The Mekong begins high on the Tibetan Plateau, descends through China, and then forms or crosses the borders of Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam before dividing into a wide delta beside the South China Sea. Along this long journey, the river changes character many times. In the upper reaches, it is narrow, cold, and fast. Farther south, it enters warmer valleys, broad floodplains, and wetlands shaped by the annual monsoon. For millions of people, the Mekong is not simply a channel of water, it is a moving calendar, marking the months of planting, fishing, travel, and harvest. Each year, the flood season brings most of the river's flow. Water rises over banks, spreads across fields and forests, carries sediment downstream, and opens temporary pathways for fish. In Cambodia, the swollen Mekong helps reverse the direction of the Tonle Sap River, pushing water into the Great Lake. When the season turns, the current reverses again, and the lake releases water back toward the Mekong. This pulse supports one of the world's most productive inland fisheries. Yet the same river also offers enormous hydropower potential. Dams in China and in the lower basin can generate electricity for cities, factories, and export markets. For Laos in particular, hydropower has been presented as a route toward national income and regional trade. Reservoirs may also store wet season water and support navigation or drought management. Downstream, however, concern gathers around what may be lost. Dams can alter the timing of floods, trap sediment, and obstruct the migrations of fish that travel long distances to breed. Farmers in the delta depend on sediment to renew soil and help maintain the land against erosion and the sea. Fishing communities depend on seasonal signals that cannot easily be replaced by electricity or compensation. The Mekong countries have built institutions for consultation, data exchange, and shared planning. Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam cooperate through the Mekong River Commission, while China and Myanmar participate as dialogue partners. Hydrological stations, forecasts, and technical procedures provide a common language for a river that no country can observe alone. Still, consultation is not the same as consent. A state may consider a dam essential to its development while a neighbor sees an irreversible risk. The disagreement is quieter than war, but it reaches into kitchens, markets, and fields. At night, the Mekong widens beneath low clouds, carrying mountain rain toward the delta. Every nation touches only one portion of its journey, yet every decision becomes part of the same water moving toward the sea. South of the cold deserts of Central Asia, Two rivers once traveled toward an inland sea, so broad that fishing boats crossed it beneath an open horizon. The Amu Darya descended from the mountains near Afghanistan and Tajikistan. The Sir Darya curved through Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. Together they fed the Aral Sea, a great lake without an outlet, balanced by river inflow and evaporation. For centuries, communities lived beside its shores and along the deltas where fresh water met salt. Reeds sheltered birds, wetlands supported fish, and ports connected towns across the water. The sea rose and fell naturally, but its existence depended upon enough of the two rivers completing their journey. During the Soviet period, planners sought to transform the dry plains into an immense agricultural landscape. Canals diverted water from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya to irrigate cotton and other crops. The ambition was vast, and so were the losses. Water seeped from unlined canals, evaporated under intense heat, and spread across fields where poor drainage left salts behind. Less and less water reached the sea. Beginning in the 1960s, the shoreline retreated across the flat basin. Harbors were left far from the water. Fishing fleets rested on sand. The sea separated into smaller bodies, some of which became increasingly salty as evaporation continued. The consequences moved outward. Fisheries collapsed, wetlands shrank. Salt and dust from the exposed seabed were carried by wind across farms and settlements. The climate near the former shore became harsher because the broad water surface no longer softened summer heat and winter cold as it once had. No foreign army had emptied the Aral Sea. The disaster emerged from a shared system managed toward a single economic goal, while the needs of the sea itself remained absent from the calculation. It became a reminder that water conflict can occur between sectors and generations as well as between countries. Cotton fields received the river, while fishing towns lost it. Present harvests were gained at the cost of a distant future. Yet the story is not entirely still. In Kazakhstan, a dike helped retain water in the northern portion of the sea. Levels rose, salinity fell, and some fisheries returned. Farther south, much of the former seabed remains exposed, and efforts now include planting hardy vegetation to reduce blowing dust. Restoration cannot easily return the entire sea to its former size. The rivers are still heavily used, and millions depend upon the agriculture built around them. But the northern recovery shows that damaged water systems can sometimes respond when flows are protected and expectations are modest. The old shoreline now lies beneath stars and silence. It asks a quiet question of every civilization. When water is redirected toward prosperity, who remembers the place from which it was taken? From the vanished shore, we turn away from visible rivers and descend into the earth, where another kind of water moves without sunlight. Beneath, plains, deserts, and mountain valleys, rain and snow melt seep through soil and stone, gathering in layers of sand, gravel, or fractured rock. These water-bearing formations are known as aquifers. Some aquifers are renewed each year by rainfall. Others contain water that entered the ground thousands of years ago, when the climate above was cooler and wetter. Pumping such ancient reserves resembles drawing from a savings account with few new deposits. Groundwater supplies wells, farms, villages, and cities. It is often most valuable during drought, when rivers fall and reservoirs shrink. Because it is hidden, it can also seem more dependable than it truly is. A river reveals its decline in exposed banks. An aquifer may fall silently, meter by meter, while pumps are lowered deeper and the surface appears unchanged. Underground water does not respect borders any more than a river does. A single aquifer may extend beneath two or several countries, though its boundaries are harder to map. Water may move slowly from one side to another or hardly move at all. Pumping in one region can lower pressure elsewhere. Pollution from farms, mines, or cities can travel beneath a frontier without a visible current to announce it. This invisibility complicates cooperation. Countries may not agree on the aquifer's size, recharge rate, or direction of flow. Wells are scattered among many users rather than gathered behind one dam. A treaty can instruct a government to release river water through a gate, but groundwater is often extracted by thousands of farmers, industries, and households making separate decisions. Science, therefore, becomes a form of diplomacy. Geologists compare rock layers. Hydrologists measure well levels and water chemistry. Satellites can reveal broad changes in underground storage, while local monitoring shows what is happening in particular communities. Shared maps and shared data allow neighboring states to discover that they are drawing from the same unseen reserve. Cooperative projects have begun in several regions, but agreements over aquifers remain less developed than those governing many famous rivers. The difficulty is partly technical and partly psychological. It is easier to protect what can be seen. Far beneath the surface, the water moves through darkness, sometimes only a few meters in a year. It carries no sediment plume, makes no sound against a bank, and offers no clear moment when scarcity begins. Yet entire societies may depend upon it. The quiet wars for groundwater may therefore arrive slowly. A well deepened, another abandoned, a field left dry. By the time the loss becomes visible, much of the reserve may already be gone. To share such water wisely, nations must learn to imagine a river beneath the stone. After so many disputed rivers, it is easy to imagine that shared water leads naturally toward conflict. Yet history tells a more patient story. Countries have argued over allocation, dams, pollution, and drought, but they have also created commissions, exchanged forecasts, financed common works, and continued meeting when nearly every other conversation had stopped. In West Africa, the Senegal River offers one of the clearest examples. It rises in the highlands of Guinea and Mali, then flows between Mauritania and Senegal before reaching the Atlantic. Its basin crosses countries with different needs, from hydropower in the upper valley to irrigation, navigation, and protection from salt water downstream. In 1972, Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal created the organization pour la mise en valeur du fleuve Senegal, known as the OMVS. Guinea later joined. Rather than treating each project as the possession of the country where it stood, the members developed a system of shared works and benefits. The Manantali Dam was built in Mali, yet the electricity produced by its turbines could be transmitted across borders. The Diama Dam, near the river's mouth, helped prevent salt water from moving inland and supported irrigation on both banks. Costs and benefits were allocated among the member states according to agreed purposes rather than simple location. This arrangement did not remove every difficulty. Dams altered ecosystems and patterns of disease, while irrigation and development created new social and environmental pressures. Cooperation does not make consequences disappear. It creates a structure through which they can be studied, argued over, and sometimes corrected. A shared river can become more valuable when nations plan it together. An upstream country may hold the best site for hydropower, while a downstream country has greater demand for electricity. One state may benefit most from flood control, another from navigation, and another from irrigation. If each insists upon receiving the same thing, agreement may fail. If they exchange different benefits, the basin becomes larger than the water alone. Successful cooperation is often built from quiet habits, regular meetings, trusted engineers, joint inspections, common data, and institutions that survive changes of government. These routines rarely attract attention, yet they help keep crisis from becoming permanent. A river treaty is therefore not a promise that disagreement will end. It is a promise about how disagreement will continue. It provides a room, a timetable, a set of measurements, and a reason to return after tempers rise. Along the Senegal River, evening settles over reservoirs, fields, and transmission lines, carrying power beyond the horizon. The water has not ceased to be scarce or politically important. It has simply been joined by another current, the slow movement of cooperation, built decision by decision across the basin. And now, after following water from ancient floodplains to modern dams, from contested rivers to an inland sea, and the chambers beneath the ground, we return to the current beside which our journey began. Fresh water is only a small portion of all the water on earth. Most lies in the oceans, too salty for fields and bodies without treatment. Much of the rest is held in ice or stored underground. The rivers that appear generous upon a map are narrow threads within a much larger world of water people cannot easily use. Civilization gathers around those threads. A river supplies drinking water, carries nutrients, turns turbines, supports wetlands, and allows crops to grow where rain is not enough. When its flow becomes uncertain, the effects travel through food prices, electricity systems, migration, public health, and politics. This is why countries seek a greater share. They are bargaining not only for water in a channel, but for future harvests, cities, and security during drought. Upstream states point to development postponed. Downstream states point to lives already arranged around the existing flow. Both look toward the future and fear being left with too little. Yet, no country truly commands the whole river. The upstream nation depends upon rainfall beyond its control, upon stable neighbors willing to buy its electricity or trade across its borders, and upon an environment capable of renewing the basin. The downstream nation may possess historic use and larger infrastructure, but it cannot move the mountains where water begins. The most durable power is not the power to hold every drop. It is the ability to create confidence that water will still arrive when the season is dry. That confidence is built through data, treaties, flexible rules, shared reservoirs, efficient farms, restored wetlands, and the patient recognition that another country's security need not always reduce one's own. There will still be arguments. Populations will grow, climates will change, and old agreements will face conditions their authors never imagined. But the history of shared water contains more negotiation than warfare, more maintenance than conquest. Again and again, those beside the same river have found that the current binds them more deeply than the border divides them. Outside, the world slows, and so do we. Rain settles upon distant hills. Snow rests in the mountains. Beneath the earth, water waits among layers of stone. Somewhere, a gate opens gently, and a measured release begins its journey downstream. The river carries no flag. It remembers no treaty and recognizes no claim. It moves from cloud to soil, from tributary to field, from one country into another, offering the same quiet lesson it has always offered. Life continues where water is allowed to pass. And for tonight, we let the current move on without us, fading into reeds, darkness, and the soft sound of the river. Good night.